Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for joining us for this quick introduction video to global change biology. My name is Ian Dickey. I'll be the course coordinator for the class, and I'll be co-teaching with Jason Tilianakis and Daniel Stauffer. Jason will cover the first third of the course, and then Daniel will come in with a series of lectures before and after break. And Daniel and I will also teach a 2-day workshop during Easter break, so make sure that's in your schedules. And then I'll come in and wrap up the course with the last set of lectures. This lecture today, this video, is just a sort of chance to introduce you to global change biology, give you a little perspective on the bigger picture, and sort of set you up for a good start to the course. So we don't have a textbook in this class, and the reason we don't have a textbook is because global change biology is a rapidly changing field. And so we're going to try to make sure that we're giving you the latest information based on scientific papers and based on other data that we'll bring into class. I have put up one recent paper. It was actually in the journal Global Change Biology, where Rowan Sage wrote a sort of primer to global change biology, and it might be useful for you to have a look at that to get some context, sort of to set the framework for the course. But the other reason I put that up is I really liked the abstract. Now Sage was writing specifically about the journal Global Change Biology, and what he wrote was that global change biology is well positioned to provide leadership in solving the global change challenge, but that if humanity cannot meet that challenge, then global change biology is positioned to serve as a leading chronicle of the 6th mass extinction to occur on planet Earth. And that sort of in a nutshell answers the question, what is global change biology? What it really is most of the time is about understanding and quantifying the effect of humans, the effect that we are having on biodiversity and on ecosystems. But aspirationally, and the hopeful side of it, is it's about providing leadership to solve some or all of those global change challenges. For this particular class, Biology 377, we have our own twist on that. So our aim, we put it within the context of community and ecosystem ecology. So we're really looking at how those two fields help us understand global change biology in all the different forms of global change biology: climate change, land use change, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, and others. So that's just a couple of them. What are the top drivers of global change? What is actually going on? Well, Sage identifies a series of them. Sage actually puts in, I think, about 10 different changes. And we can think about those as sort of, some of them are truly global in scale. When you put CO2 into the atmosphere, when the climate changes, or when you add ozone to the atmosphere, those are changing the global environment. They're truly a global change. The other factors, land transformation, exotic species, and others, are more local. That they're not necessarily, the effect isn't global of any one introduction, but they're so widespread, they're so common, they occur everywhere, so they end up getting considered global change drivers as well. This list didn't particularly speak to me. It doesn't have much order or structure. Some of them are things that we're doing, like putting CO2 into the environment. Others are more the response of the environment, like climate change. So I came up with my own framework, which might help you see how these things connect. And it starts with us, with the human population and per capita impact. And I'll go through each of these during this video. And you can sort of consider 3 big things that human population does. We use resources to survive and for our own pleasure or purposes. We modify ecosystems. We change land or sea use, clearing forests, bulldozing areas, changing areas, introducing species. And then we also put pollution into the environment. In the process of using resources, in the process of living, we're creating pollution in various forms. So resource use includes things like overfarming, deforestation, desertification, or seabed mining. All these are about extracting a resource from the environment. Land use change, probably the biggest one is agriculture, which we'll talk about, but also urbanization, causing a loss of habitat, bringing in new species to environments that become invasive, including some pathogen outbreaks, both driven by the changes in the environment and by bringing species in. And then pollution, we can think about all sorts of pollution we put into the environment: pesticides, nutrients like nitrogen, CFCs, ozone, and the big ones, of course, carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, which are leading to global climate change. But also more modern pollutants. So we started thinking about things like plastics, microplastics into the environment, which I'll lecture on right at the end of the course, or even things like noise and light. All of those things have consequences. And in particular, they link through to changes in biodiversity and through linking to biodiversity, impact ecosystem function, and other things directly impact on functioning of ecosystems. That is the basic ways that ecosystems perform their processes that maintain the Earth envelope in which we live. And the reason we care about this, of course, is that it impacts back on us. It directly affects the ability of ecosystems to support human life, which we sometimes call ecosystem services, or we're sort of changing the terminology more recently to talking about it as nature's contribution to people. And of course, that is why it is linking right back and closing the circle to an impact on humans. So you hear a lot, I'm going to go through those in a little more detail. You hear a lot about population growth. The good news on population growth is that it is starting to show signs of slowing down. On the 15th of November is the estimate that the human population actually hit 8 billion. It's expected to go up to 10 billion by about 2057. So that's well within all of your lifetimes. And then to sort of plateau for quite a period and start to decline. In some cases, that decline is already starting to happen. You'll see headlines, for example, recent ones about Japan, where they're actually worried that the population is slowing so fast that they won't have enough young people to take care of the old people in the coming years. Now, you might look at that and think, well, the contribution of New Zealand is tiny to the human population. That is true. And that's why there's the other side to think about, which is the per capita impact. It's not just that our population has doubled since 1970. It's also that the per capita, each one of those people is having a much bigger impact on the environment. So in that same time as the population has doubled, the per capita spending has actually increased 13-fold, meaning we're doing 13 times more activity economically per person. Global travel has gone up 9 times, 900% increase in global travel. And meat consumption, for example, per capita has doubled over that time. So you take those increasing per capita impacts and combine it with the increasing human population, that's where you're getting the really big global change impact. And New Zealand is certainly at the upper end of that spectrum. Here we've been linked together with Australia, but of all the countries in the world on a per capita basis, so that's how long these arrows are, our impact is truly substantial. We have a very, very large impact, and it's only our small population that limits the total effect. So what are all these people doing? Well, one thing, as I said, is resource use, and this is a huge driver of global change. Just a really simple example of that, overfishing. So right now, humans are using about 93 million tons of fish being extracted from the world oceans, and an additional almost 39 million tons of bycatch. That's things that are being caught that aren't the desired crop. We are massively over-extracting that resource. About 30% of fish stocks are currently considered overfished, that we're beyond the sustainable envelope of what the oceans can support. And another 61% are considered fully fished, that any further consumption will drive them into overfishing. Among those, there's actually 73 globally threatened species that are direct targets of harvesting. So we are continuing to directly fish and hunt for species that are nearing extinction. And we can see examples of that close to home. We can see that, for example, there's an international pet trade where people come to New Zealand and have tried to smuggle our native geckos out of the country to supply the resource consumption needs of pet owners who want that particular species of reptile. And whitebait is a truly amazing example of an endangered species, or a group of endangered species that are still being commercially sold. So this is not a problem of other people. This is a problem within our own country. So that's one big class of impacts that we'll cover in this course. We'll also talk a lot about land use change, because the human population, as it's grown, is massively modifying the environment that they live in. At present, about 70% of the vegetated land area of Earth is human modified. It's estimated that between 2010 and 2020, we're losing about almost 5 million hectares of forest per year. Now that's actually in some ways an improvement. We reached our peak deforestation in 1980, so we are slowing that down, but we're continuing to lose forest. And that impact ramifies through to the animal kingdom as well. In fact, right now it's estimated that more than 3/4 of the vertebrate biomass on Earth, more than 3 out of every 4 animals on Earth, is a domestic animal in terms of biomass. An additional 23% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass on Earth is actually us, is humans. That leaves 1% for all other vertebrates on Earth. So it's no wonder that we're changing land on a truly massive scale, largely for production of meat and dairy. In New Zealand, at present, we've got about 40% of our land area is in exotic grasslands to support the meat and dairy industry. An additional 8% of the country is in forest plantations, almost entirely pine and Douglas fir. 2% is in horticulture and about 1% in urban, which leaves less than half of our native land cover remaining. So we are changing the landscape on a scale that is truly unprecedented. The third major driver, and the one that people often think about first when they think about global change, is pollution. And this is both a global and a local issue. So we can think about, as I said earlier, things like CO2 or CFCs as changing the whole global envelope, changing the climate or creating the ozone hole. But there are also a lot of more local pollutions. Ozone, for example, at a local scale, when it's at our layer of the atmosphere, is actually quite damaging. It can damage plant leaves. Nitrogen as a fertilizer has huge impacts. Particulate matter, when we breathe it in or when animals breathe it in. Microplastics, we don't even know quite what the impacts of plastics are in the environment, but we are producing them at enormous rates. And then things like light and noise that you might not think of as pollutants, but that have a huge impact on animals trying to live in this environment. And the scale of this is extremely large. So air pollution, for example, right now, it has been claimed that it accounts for about 12% of human deaths worldwide. And who knows how many animals are suffering a similar death rate from the pollution that we're putting into the environment. So I mentioned animals, and that's sort of where this all comes home. All of these different changes through resource use, land use change, and pollution ultimately impact onto biodiversity. And that's where when I started this little video, I mentioned the 6th global mass extinction. So where does that phrase come from? It comes from geology, really, that we know that throughout Earth's recent history, that is since the Cambrian, there have been 5 mass extinction events. And a mass extinction event is defined as a loss of 75% or more of species on Earth in a relatively short period. Now, what relatively short means, we can argue about its geological, so a few million years. The causes of these are not always entirely clear, but they can include things like shifts in temperature, impacts of asteroids hitting the Earth, ocean oxygen levels, volcanic activity. Various big global change drivers have led to these 5 mass extinctions. So are we in a 6th mass extinction? There was a recent review of this that looked at it, and they concluded that yes, there were a large number of extinctions on Earth. A lot of those were actually sort of pre-modern history. So as the human species migrated across the globe, it caused very large numbers of species losses. Just in the South Pacific, birds, for example, we lost about 1,000 species alone. So very large losses of biological diversity in the past. It's been observed that since 1500, there have only, and I say only in quotes because I think you can view that both ways, but there have only been 338 vertebrates that we know have gone extinct. And so some have argued actually it's not that big a number. That obscures things. One is that although species might not be extinct, there have been enormous losses of populations and genetic diversity within species, even if the species itself has managed to persist as a few individuals. The other thing is that for invertebrates, for example, we've only assessed and considered about 2% of the known invertebrates. Most invertebrates we don't even know exist, let alone having considered whether they're at risk of extinction. So hidden extinctions might be a huge loss of biodiversity. It's unquestionable that the rate of extinctions is much higher now than it was in the past. So there's a recent review by Diaz and Malhi, came out in 2022, that looked at the rate of extinction both in pre-human times, and this is extinctions per million species, and they found that there's always been extinctions. Extinctions is part of the natural background of biology, but the rate of extinction has gone up more than tenfold, more than 10 times higher than it was in the past. And if we were to look at all of biodiversity, and this is particularly including all that unknown biodiversity of things that we don't even know are going extinct, but we can sort of extrapolate as to what the extinction rate might be, that rate is massively higher. So it isn't actually clear. Are we at the start of the sixth mass extinction? We really don't know yet. What is clear and unequivocal is that our current extinction rates are higher than the average at any time in human history. We have massive numbers of species going extinct. That certainly we can't rule out that we will reach that 76% of species to qualify as a mass extinction event. It's certainly within possibility, but it would take a few centuries to get there at least. But also, and this is a really important point, that is preventable. This is not something where we just have to throw our hands up. We can actually take steps that would prevent those mass extinctions from taking place. And I think that's a really positive message that came out of that review. For this class, I want to give you three last sort of major considerations to think about in terms of all of these drivers. The rate of change, and that is how quickly things are changing. Multiple drivers interacting, and linking it back through ecosystem services. And this, I like this cartoon. This is the hottest summer of my life. This is the hottest summer of your life so far. And that's the story of our lives, right? Every year it seems like it's a new record hot year. Every year it seems like we're getting more and more extreme climate events. And that's not actually untrue. That the rate of change is enormous. So that if you look at, this is looking at CO2 levels in the atmosphere, yes, it has fluctuated in the past, but we are currently very, very much higher. So the rate of change is enormous. And we see that in the global temperatures, that it's just going up and up and up every year. Even within our own human time frame, we can now, you recognize this, you see this in your own life. Now, some people point out that CO2 levels are actually low in some ways compared to historic levels. If you go back far enough, if you go back 400 or more million years ago, CO2 levels were much, much higher. But that's sort of irrelevant because humans have only been on the Earth for about 1.9 million years. So these are the highest CO2 levels that we as a species have ever experienced. And we're not adapted to these sort of climates that we would have if they were to go back to this massively pre-human times. It's also worth pointing out that back when the CO2 levels were that high, the temperatures were also 14 degrees higher. So we're moving, yes, we are within the envelope of some geological time frame of CO2, but the rate of change is unprecedented. It's going up so fast. And it's simply we and the species around us are not adapted to that level of change. Second major point. these drivers are not acting in isolation. And that's why I've shown you this ridiculous diagram with all these arrows going every which way, is to show you that there are multiple drivers interacting, all of which are simultaneously affecting ecosystems. Scientists aren't very good at dealing with that. A friend of mine, Matthias Rillig, just published a paper recently in Science, where he pointed out first that many scientific studies, in fact, most scientific studies, look at either one or two global change drivers. It's very rare for a study to consider even as many as four. And yet we know that all these drivers are acting at the same time. And we don't know, when you start adding together all these different drivers, what the impact will be. Will it have an increasing loss of function? Will it get worse and worse, or not? So we've tended to think about this as having a bunch of environmental drivers, and then we choose one and choose to study that one, and that has some impact on some species, and that affects some ecosystem processes. But what if we started thinking about all of those drivers at once? When you start having multiple things interacting, they might interact with each other. You might have two drivers, one of which is amplifying or complementing or inhibiting the effect of the other. The other possibility is just selection effect, that as you add drivers, you're more and more and more likely to get the one that's going to cause the major effect. And we really need to start thinking in that framework in terms of ecosystem function. So Matthias and his team took that a step further. They're soil ecologists, and so they looked at a number of different functions of soil aggregation, that's how well soils clump together, hydrophobicity, how much it resists water going into it, decomposition rates, and soil respiration. These are key ecosystem functions. And then they exposed them both individually to a single driver at a time, and also to increasing numbers of drivers. And what you see is that those functions, they didn't plateau. They changed more and more rapidly as you added more drivers, in some cases really collapsing when you started getting up in terms of the number of drivers, up to closer to 10 drivers all in the same study. That's where you saw the collapse of the ecosystem function. And that's the world we live in, because actually all of these things are being impacted by all the different drivers all at the same time. The last major point I'll leave you with is that this matters to humans. And this is linking into this idea of, sometimes it's called ecosystem services, or sometimes it's called nature's contribution to people. The other video we've asked you to watch talks about this and identifies 4 different types of ecosystem services: those that support, those that regulate. And so those are about the provision of carbon, the provision of oxygen, nitrogen, water. And then there's things about provisioning. So those are resources that we're actually using to feed us or to support our activities, but also the cultural and social values of nature. And we cannot leave people out of the equation for global change, because really we're not only the driver of the global change, we're also being directly impacted by the global change. And so we have to consider that, and that would be a big part of this course as well. So hopefully that gives you a little introduction. Thanks for watching this. And I really look forward to seeing you in class. Jason will pick up from here, and I think we'll be launching straight into the nature's contribution to people area and giving you more detail around that. And there'll also be some resources on there, and make sure that you're keeping up on the readings because they're a really important part of this course as well. With that, I'll close. And again, thank you for watching. Cheers.